Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city. Perhaps the next story about betrayal will be from your city. And we start. Mark Banks woke up that day with the usual buzzing in his head, a mixture of last night's whiskey and the morning light breaking through the blinds. It was 6:45 a.m., and outside Denver was already beginning its day. Somewhere in the distance, cars were honking on I-25, and the neighbor's dog, like clockwork, was barking at the mailman. Mark stretched, feeling the joints in his 44-year-old body crack, and glanced at the empty half of the bed. Rachel must have gotten up by now. He heard the sound of water coming from the bathroom, faint but insistent, like a distant waterfall. He sat up, rubbing his neck, and tried to remember if he had talked to Rachel about anything important yesterday. Lately, their conversations have been limited to short, "How are you?" and "What's for dinner?" Working in real estate was exhausting for him. Endless showings of houses, clients who couldn't decide whether they wanted 3 bedrooms or 4, and constant calls from banks checking credit histories. Rachel also looked tired. Her job as an accountant at the construction firm Harrison and Sons did not leave much time for rest. But today something was wrong. Mark felt it even before he got out of bed. He pulled on the old jeans and Rocky's t-shirt he wore at home and wandered into the kitchen. The coffee maker was already hissing. Rachel, as always, turned it on before going to the shower. Mark poured himself a cup, burning his fingers on the hot ceramic, and leaned against the countertop, looking out the window. The morning fog hung over the mountains, making them look like ghosts that were about to melt away. He took a sip and winced. The coffee was too bitter. "We need to buy a new one," he thought, but immediately discarded the thought. The money was already barely enough to cover the mortgage on their home in the Washington Park neighborhood. The bathroom door opened, and Mark heard Rachel's footsteps on the wooden floor. He turned, expecting to see her in her usual gray robe, with wet hair wrapped in a towel. But instead, she came out wearing something that took his breath away. The lace lingerie is black, with thin straps, hugging her figure as if it was made especially for her. Mark froze, holding the cup halfway to his mouth. He didn't give her anything like that. The last time he bought her a gift was a coffee machine for Christmas 2 years ago, and definitely not lace. "Good morning," Rachel said without looking at him. Her voice was smooth, almost mechanical, like that of someone who repeats the same phrase every day. She walked to the bedroom closet, leaving a light trail of floral shampoo behind her. "Morning," Mark squeezed out, still trying to comprehend what he had seen. He put the cup on the table and followed it, trying not to make any noise. Rachel stood in front of the mirror, pulling her blouse over the damn underwear. Her movements were fast, confident, but there was something else in them, a nervousness that he had not noticed before. "You're early today," he said, leaning against the door frame. He tried to sound casual, but his voice trembled treacherously. "Yes, we need to finish the report by 9, she answered without turning around. She took the lipstick from the dresser, a bright red one, which Mark had seen her wear for the first time. Rachel never wore lipstick before work. She rarely wore makeup at all, except when they went to dinner with friends or to her company's corporate events. But now she carefully ran the lipstick over her lips, looking at herself in the mirror with such attention, as if she was preparing for something important. Mark felt a tingling sensation in his chest. He was no fool. Over 17 years of marriage, he learned to read her like an open book, or thought he had learned. But this, the lace, the lipstick, her distant tone was something new, something he couldn't explain. "New underwear?" he asked, trying to hide his suspicion behind a slight smile. "It looks expensive." Rachel froze for a second, her lipstick hand hovering in the air. Then she shrugged and said briefly, "A gift from a friend. I decided to try it on." She turned to him, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes, dark brown, with small golden sparkles, were the same as always. But there was something else about them. Fatigue, secret, Mark couldn't understand. "From a friend, then," he repeated, nodding as if in agreement. "Which friend?" "Linda," Rachel said, too quickly. Linda was her colleague, a cheerful woman in her 50s who liked to gossip and drink margaritas on Fridays. Mark saw her a couple of times at company parties. Linda didn't seem like the type to give Lacey lingerie, but he remained silent. Rachel grabbed her bag and keys, throwing them over her shoulder. I ran. See you in the evening. Yeah, Mark replied, watching her leave. The door slammed, and he was left alone in the silence of the house, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. He walked to the window and saw her Toyota Camry leaving the yard, turning onto Colfax Avenue. She didn't even look back. Mark returned to the bedroom and sat on the bed, still warm on her side. His gaze fell on the chest of drawers where that same lipstick lay. He took it in his hands and turned it over, as if it might give answers. Revlon, shade, sunset red. He opened the lid and sniffed it. It was Swedish, with a hint of chemicals. For some reason, this made him angry. He threw the lipstick back and ran his hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts. He had an appointment at 9 to show a house in Cherry Creek for a couple from California who were looking for something with mountain views and the soul of Colorado. But now he couldn't think about work. Something was wrong. He felt it in his bones, like an old dog feels the approach of a thunderstorm. He stood up and walked over to Rachel's closet. He opened the door and glanced over her things. Neatly folded sweaters, a couple of dresses she wore to friends' weddings, jeans frayed at the knees. Nothing unusual. But then he noticed a box on the top shelf, small, white, with a gold ribbon. He reached for it, feeling his heart beat faster. There was a note inside. Short, handwritten. Wear this and think of me. D. Mark read it 3 times before he got it. D. Who is D? He clenched the piece of paper in his fist, feeling the blood rush to his face. It could be anything. Maybe it really was from Linda. Her name was Dorothy, if he remembered correctly. But Lace? Think of me? It didn't sound like a gift from a friend. He threw the box back and grabbed the phone. He opened his calendar and canceled the meeting, sending a short message to his assistant. Urgent matter, reschedule for tomorrow. Then he sat on the sofa in the living room, staring into space. His mind raced between explanations. Maybe he's exaggerating. Maybe Rachel just wanted to feel beautiful. But the lace, the lipstick, this note. Everything added up to a picture that he didn't want to see. Mark stood up and went to the window, looking out onto the street. The neighbor, Mrs. Clare, was watering her roses, humming something under her breath. Everything looked so calm, so normal. But there was a growing feeling inside him that his world was about to collapse. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to just sit around and wait for the truth to surface. He returned to the bedroom, opened the drawer with her things, and began to rummage. Nothing. Just old t-shirts, socks, a couple of accounting books. Then he went to the bathroom. Her phone was on the shelf. She had forgotten it in her haste. Mark took it in his hands, feeling his fingers tremble. He knew her password, the birthday of their dog, Lucy, who died 3 years ago. 0412. The screen lights up. Messages. He opened them, scrolling through the list. Linda, Rachel's mom, a couple of colleagues. And then he saw the name, Dan. Dan Carter, a foreman from her company. Mark had seen him a couple of times, tall, with broad shoulders and light gray hair. Regular guy, loved to talk about fishing and Broncos. Nothing special, but now the name looked like a red flag. The last message from Dan was sent last night. Tomorrow at 8, can't wait. Rachel's response, yes, I'll be ready. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He scrolled up. More messages. You were amazing today. You have the best hands in the world. I miss your voice. Every word hit like a hammer. He put the phone back, trying to breathe evenly. This is not proof. These are just words. But the words formed a story that he did not want to accept. Mark sat on the edge of the bathtub, looking at his hands. They were shaking. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't let it go just like that. Today, he will stay at home. Today, he will start to figure it out. Mark sat on the couch, staring at the blank screen of the TV, which he didn't even turn on. The silence in the house weighed on him like a heavy blanket, and only the ticking of the wall clock in the living room reminded him that time was still passing. He held a mug of cooled coffee in his hands, but did not drink. He simply rolled it between his palms, feeling how the ceramic cooled his skin. Rachel's phone lay on the coffee table in front of him, face down, like a sleeping beast that he was afraid to wake. The messages from Dan still burned in his mind, every word like a thorn he couldn't pull out. He looked at his watch, 7:15 am. Rachel had left less than an hour ago, and he already felt like a whole day had passed. Mark stood up and walked around the room, trying to distract himself. He went to the window, opened the blinds, and looked out onto the street. Mrs. Clare was still busy with her roses, her bright yellow hat flashing among the bushes. Everything looked so damn normal, it was almost infuriating. He turned away and glanced at Rachel's phone. Something had to be done. But what? Follow her, call her, and demand an explanation? Or should I just put it out of my mind and pretend nothing is happening? His thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of an engine. Mark looked out the window again and froze. A white truck with a Warren Harrison and Sons logo on the side rolled slowly down the street. The same logo he had seen on Rachel's business cards and on the t-shirts she brought home from office parties. The truck stopped right in front of their house. The engine stopped, and a man got out of the cab. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a work jacket and jeans. Dan Carter. Mark recognized him immediately, the same foreman who once told him about catching trout on Lake Granby. Then he seemed to Mark a simple guy, harmless. Now every step he took seemed like a threat. The passenger side door opened and Rachel stepped out of the truck. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and the blouse she had put on this morning looked slightly wrinkled. She said something to Dan, and he laughed a low, raucous laugh that Mark could hear even through the closed window. They walked toward the front door, and Mark saw Rachel leaning toward a pot of geraniums by the porch. She picked it up and took out the key, the same, just in case, that they had left there for years. Mark felt his blood run cold. She brought him here, to their house. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. The door opened, and he heard voices muffled, but familiar. Rachel said something, Dan answered, and their footsteps thundered on the wooden floor. Mark rushed to the back door, the one that led through the kitchen into the yard. He didn't know what he was going to do, but sitting and waiting was beyond his strength. He grabbed his phone from the couch, put it on recording mode, and stuffed it into his jeans pocket. Then I remembered the old voice recorder that was lying in the kitchen table drawer small, with a worn rec button. He pulled it out, checked the batteries, and pressed record. 2 devices in case one fails. He wasn't going to miss a sound. The back door creaked as he slipped out into the yard. The cold morning air hit his face, but Mark barely noticed it. He walked around the house, pressing against the wall, until he was at the back door. The door was ajar. Rachel and Dan didn't even bother to close it. He slipped inside, trying to walk quietly, although the floorboards creaked treacherously under his feet. Voices came from the living room, Rachel laughing, Dan muttering something in response. Mark stopped at the wall separating the kitchen from the living room and listened. "I can't believe you did that," Rachel said, her voice soft, almost playful. "Do you even realize how risky this is?" "I don't care," Dan answered, and there was something firm and confident in his tone. "I'm ready to do anything for you." Mark clenched his fists. He wanted to rush in, grab Dan by the collar, and throw him out. But instead, he forced himself to breathe deeply and move towards the stairs. If he goes upstairs, he can hear more, maybe even see it. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something told him that the truth was waiting for him there, in the bedroom. The stairs were old, with worn steps that creaked with every step. Mark moved slowly, pressing against the railing to distribute his weight. He heard the voices below fade away, replaced by the rustling of clothes and quiet laughter. His stomach churned. He reached the top platform and stopped listening. The door to the bedroom was slightly open, and sounds were coming from there, not words, but something else. Low, rhythmic moans. Mark felt his legs give way. He leaned against the wall, trying not to make a sound. His hand automatically reached for the phone in his pocket, checking that it was recording. The recorder in his other hand was warm from his palm, the red light blinking, confirming that it was working. The moans became louder, interspersed with short sighs and the rustling of sheets. This was their bed, their bedroom, their life, which he had built with Rachel for 17 years. He took a step forward, peering into the gap between the door and the jamb. The light from the window fell on the bed, and he saw them. Rachel lay on her back, her hair scattered across the pillow, and her blouse was unbuttoned, exposing the same lacy lingerie. Dan leaned over her, his jacket lying on the floor, and his hands moved over her body with the confidence of a man who had done this not for the first time. Mark could not look away, although every detail cut him like a knife. Her fingers dug into Dan's shoulders, her lips parted, and she let out another moan low, drawn out, full of something Mark hadn't heard from her in years. "God, Ratch, you're driving me crazy," Dan muttered, his voice hoarse, almost animalistic. He leaned lower, kissing her neck, and she arched towards him. "Don't stop," she breathed, and those words hit Mark harder than anything else. He knew her voice, knew every shade of it, but now it sounded different, more alive than ever with him. Mark stepped back, putting his hand to his mouth so as not to give himself away. His heart was beating so loudly that he was afraid they would hear. He wanted to rush in there, scream, fight, but something kept him in place. Maybe fear, maybe it's disbelief, or maybe he just wanted to collect more evidence so that later, when all this was over, he would have something other than empty words. He squatted against the wall, holding the recorder close to the door. The sound was clear, the creaking of the bed, their breathing, the short phrases they threw to each other. "You're so beautiful. I feel so good with you." Every word felt like a punch to the gut. Mark closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the sounds penetrated him, filling everything inside. Mark stood against the wall, leaning his back against the cold plaster, and listened as the sounds from the bedroom became louder, more insistent. Rachel's moans, Dan's hoarse voice, the creaking of the bed, all this gnawed into his consciousness like a rusty nail. His fingers clutched the phone and recorder, his knuckles white with tension. He could have broken in there. He could have screamed, thrown his fists at Dan, and thrown him out of his house. But something inside him, maybe fear, or maybe cold calculation, made him stop. It would be too easy to intervene now, too fast. He wanted them to feel it, all. He walked down the stairs slowly, trying not to make a sound. Each step reverberated through his body like a hammer blow, but he controlled himself. Downstairs in the living room, he paused, glancing at the bedroom door upstairs. It was still slightly open, and muffled sounds were coming from there now, not moans, but quiet chuckles and whispers. "They're done." Mark swallowed the lump in his throat and walked into the kitchen, where he left his phone on charge. He put the recorder in his pocket and picked up the phone, opening the contacts. The first thing he did was find the number of Tom Haley, Rachel's father. Tom was a strapping old man of 68, a retired mechanic who still worked on an old Chevy in his garage in Boulder. Mark always respected him, direct, taciturn, with hands covered with scars from work. They weren't close, but Tom always treated him like the son he never had. Mark pressed call, holding the phone to his ear. The beeps went on for a long time, and he already thought that the old man would not answer the phone, but finally a hoarse voice was heard. "Mark, what's happened? It's early." Mark took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice level. "Tom, hi. Sorry it's so early. I need to talk to you. This is about Rachel." The pause on the other end was heavy, as if Tom already felt that something was wrong. "What's wrong with her? Is she okay?" Concern appeared in the old man's voice. Mark hesitated, looking out the window where the Harrison and Sons truck was still parked at the curb. "She's at home, with another man, right now." Tom coughed as if he was choking on air. "Are you serious?" "What the hell, Mark? Are you sure?" "I hear them, Tom. They are in our bedroom. I wrote this down if necessary." He clutched the phone tighter, feeling his anger begin to break through his numbness. "I don't know what to do, but I thought you should know." There was silence on the other end. Only Tom could be heard breathing heavily. Then he said, quietly but firmly, I will come. Give me an hour. And Mark, don't do anything stupid while I'm gone. Do you promise? I promise, Mark answered, although he himself was not sure whether he would keep this promise. He hung up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. One is ready. The next call was difficult for Julia, Rachel's daughter from her first marriage. Julia was 23, living in Fort Collins, working as a graphic designer and rarely coming home since leaving for college. Mark always got along with her. She was witty, a little sassy, but with a soft heart. He dialed her number and she answered almost immediately, her voice sleepy but cheerful. Mark, why are you calling so early? Everything is fine. Hello, Julie. No, it's not normal, he said, trying not to lose his temper. I just caught your mom with another guy. At our house, right now. Julia fell silent, and Mark heard her sit up on the bed. The sheets rustled. Wait, what? Are you serious? With whom? Dan Carter, a foreman from her company. They. He hesitated, not knowing how to say it more gently. They are in the bedroom. I wrote everything down. Oh my God, Mark. Her voice became sharper, angry. This bitch. I knew she was hiding something, but this? Are you okay? No, he answered honestly. I don't know what to do. Just thought you should know. Damn it, of course I should know. Julia cursed again, and Mark almost smiled. She was always so direct, like her grandfather. I will come. Today, you don't have to deal with this alone. Thank you, Julie, he said, feeling his chest become a little lighter. See you. He hung up and scrolled further down the list of contacts. Laura Carter, Dan's wife. Mark had met her a couple of times at company parties with short blonde hair and tired eyes. She worked as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital and seemed quiet, a little withdrawn. They got to talking one day over beers when Dan and Rachel were chatting about work. Laura then complained that Dan always stayed late, and Mark laughed, saying that Rachel did too. Now this joke seemed bitter. He found her number on the old guest list from last year's barbecue and pressed call. The beeps went on for a long time, and he thought it would go to voicemail, but finally she answered, her voice hoarse, as if she had just woken up. Hello? Who is this? Laura, this is Mark Banks. Rachel's husband, he said, trying to speak calmly. Sorry for waking you up. I have news. Mark? She coughed, and he heard her sit up. What's happened? I just caught Dan and Rachel together. At our house. He hesitated, but decided not to soften. They sleep with each other. Right now. Laura was silent for so long that Mark thought the connection had been lost. Then she said quietly, You are sure? I hear them, Laura. I wrote it down. He swallowed, feeling guilty that he was ruining her morning. I'm sorry you have to hear this, but I thought you should know. Lord, she breathed, and there were tears in her voice. I knew he was lying about these late shifts. But what about Rachel? In your house? Yes, Mark confirmed. I don't know how long this lasts, but I'm not going to put up with it, and I thought you wouldn't want it either. Hell no, she said, her voice becoming firmer. Thank you, Mark. I'll be right there. Reset your address. How are you? It sucks, he admitted, but I can handle it. Me too, she replied, steel in her tone. See you, Mark? He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling. It was quiet upstairs, no moans, no whispers. Maybe they're done. Maybe they're getting dressed. Or they just lie there in his bed, thinking that no one will catch them. Mark clenched his fists, but did not move. He made his calls. Now he waited. He got up, went to the window, and looked out. The truck was still parked at the curb, the Harrison and Sons logo a mockery. Mark took out his phone and checked the recording. It was still running, recording every sound. He turned it off, saved it, and did the same with the recorder. The evidence was in his hands. Now all that remained was to decide what to do with them. Mark stood at the kitchen window, looking at the truck with the Harrison and Sons logo still stuck out by the side of the road like a thorn in the side. The silence upstairs weighed heavily on him, but he knew they were there, Rachel and Dan, in his bedroom on his bed. The phone in my pocket was heavy with recordings. The recorder lay on the table, blinking with a red light. He made calls. Now all that was left was to wait. But the wait was unbearable. He heard the sound of a car pulling up Laura Carter's old Ford, with a scuffed bumper and a nurse's Do It Better sticker on the rear window. She jumped out of the car, her blonde hair disheveled and her face as pale as chalk. Mark opened the door before she even knocked. Laura stood on the threshold, clutching her purse. Her eyes were red, but dry tears had not yet broken through. "Where are they?" she asked. Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it. "Upstairs," Mark answered, nodding toward the stairs. "In the bedroom." Laura pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening on the strap of her purse until her knuckles turned white. She looked at him as if asking permission, and Mark nodded. He wasn't going to stop her. He wanted this as much as she did. "Let's go," he said quietly, and they began to climb the stairs. Each step was like a hammer blow, echoing in his head. Laura walked ahead. Her steps were fast, decisive, although he saw how her shoulders were trembling. They stopped at the bedroom door ajar, just as he had left it. Quiet voices could be heard from inside. Rachel was whispering something. Dan was answering in a low, satisfied tone. Mark pushed the door, and it opened fully, with a slight creaking of the hinges. The sight before him was like a punch to the gut. Rachel lay on the bed, the sheet carelessly covering her legs, the lace underwear wrinkled but still on her. Dan sat next to him, shirtless, his jacket lying on the floor. They froze, staring at Mark and Laura like deer in headlights. "What the hell?" Dan squeezed out, his face turning purple. He jumped up, grabbing his jeans from the floor, but Laura didn't let him finish. "You pathetic bastard," she screamed, bursting into the room. Her voice broke into a squeal and tears finally broke through, running down her cheeks. "This is my husband, Rachel. How could you?" Rachel sat up, pulling the sheet up to her chest. Her face was pale, but there was no shame in her eyes, only defiance. "Laura, she began, but Laura interrupted her by stepping closer. "Don't you dare talk to me. You sleep with my husband in your house, on this damn bed, so what? Do you think I'll just walk away and forget?" She turned to Dan, who was still trying to pull on his jeans. "And you lied to me about late shifts, about being tired, and you fucked her. How long does this take, Dan? How many?" Dan raised his hands as if trying to defend himself. "Laura, listen, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" She laughed hysterically, breaking into sobs. "I see it with my own eyes, you piece of shit." Mark stood in the doorway, silent, feeling how anger and pain merged in his chest into one burning lump. He wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. At that moment, the noise of an engine was heard. Another car drove up to the house. He looked out the window and saw Tom Haley's old Chevrolet, and next to it was Julia's dusty Honda Civic. They have arrived, faster than he expected. A minute later, the front door slammed and footsteps thundered down the stairs. Tom appeared first, tall, with gray hair and wrinkles that made his face look like a map of old roads. Julia followed him, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and her eyes blazing with rage. They burst into the bedroom, and the scene froze like a scene from a movie. "What the hell is going on here?" Tom barked, his voice like a clap of thunder. He looked at Rachel, then at Dan, and his fists clenched. "Is this the same guy, Mark?" "Yes," Mark replied, his voice hoarse but firm. "Dan Carter, foreman from her company." Julia stepped forward, her gaze fixed on her mother. "Are you serious, Mom? In our bedroom? With him?" She nodded at Dan, her lips trembling with anger. "Do you even understand what you're doing to Mark, with us?" Rachel stood up from the bed, still holding the sheet to her chest. Her face was tense, but she didn't look away. "That's enough," she said, her voice unexpectedly calm. "I'm tired of pretending. Yes, I'm with Dan, and I'm not going to apologize for it." Laura sobbed, covering her face with her hands, but Rachel continued, looking at everyone in turn. "I'm in love with him. For a long time now, and I don't want to live a lie anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Mark felt the ground disappear from under his feet. He looked at the woman with whom he shared 17 years of his life, at her dark eyes that had once been his home and did not recognize her. Laura collapsed to her knees, her sobs filling the room. Julia stepped towards her mother, her face distorted with pain and rage. "Are you in love?" she shouted. "What about us? What about Dad? Is Mark just furniture to you?" Tom grabbed Julia by the shoulder, holding her back. "Calm down, girl," he said quietly, but his eyes were focused on Rachel. "Do you even understand what you did, Ratch? You're tearing apart a family. Your family." "This is not a family, Dad," Rachel snapped, her voice wavering, but she held on. "It was a cage. I was out of breath. I'm alive with Dan." Dan, still half-dressed, stepped towards her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "We didn't want it to happen like this," he said, looking at Laura, then at Mark. "But it's true. We love each other." Laura jumped up, her tears giving way to rage. "Love? You leave me for her and call it love?" She rushed at Dan, her fists pounding on his chest. "You ruined everything, Dan. All." Mark grabbed her shoulders, pulling her back. She resisted, shouting curses, but he held tightly. "That's enough, Laura," he said quietly. "They're not worth it." The room erupted into chaos. Laura was sobbing, Julia was screaming at her mother, Tom was trying to calm everyone down, and Rachel and Dan stood in the middle of it like statues, their faces a mixture of guilt and stubbornness. Mark let go of Laura and retreated to the door, feeling how everything inside him was collapsing. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This was the end of everything. The chaos in the bedroom gradually subsided, but tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like smoke from a smoldering fire. Laura sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, her face wet with tears and her hands trembling. Julia stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on her mother, but she was silent, as if the words were stuck in her throat. Dan pulled on his shirt, his movements harsh and awkward, and Rachel still held the sheet to her chest, her chin raised high despite the storm around her. Mark stood in the doorway, feeling his body become foreign heavy, wooden, as if he no longer belonged to himself. Tom Haley stepped forward, his aged joints cracking as he stood up to his full height. His eyes, usually warm and tired, were now cold as steel. He looked at Rachel, his only daughter, and the room fell into a silence so deep that he could hear the clock ticking downstairs. Everyone froze, waiting for what he would say. Maybe he will protect her, like any father. Maybe he'll try to find an excuse. But Tom spoke, and his voice was low, hard, with a bitter aftertaste of disappointment. "You have followed the path of your mother, Rachel," he said, pronouncing each word slowly, as if they were burning his tongue. "Only worse." Rachel winced, her face trembling, but she didn't look away. Everyone knew what he was talking about. Her mother, Alice, ran away when Rachel was 12, leaving Tom with a daughter and a mountain of debt. Alice went to some car salesman from Pueblo, leaving everything for love, as she said then. Tom raised Rachel alone, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. He never spoke ill of the past, but everyone saw the scars in his silence, in his loneliness. And now he looked at his daughter, who, in his opinion, had stepped on the same rake, only driven it deeper into the ground. "Do you think this is love?" Tom continued, nodding at Dan, who froze next to Rachel. "This is not love, girl. This is selfishness. You spat on your family, on Mark, on Julia. And for what? For this?" He waved his hand towards Dan, his voice becoming hoarse. "At least your mother left quietly. And you organized a circus in your own house." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but Tom raised his hand to stop her. "Don't you dare," he said. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You destroyed everything you had. And for what? For a guy who can't even look me in the eyes?" He glanced at Dan, who lowered his head, avoiding his gaze. "You are my daughter, Ratch. But now I don't recognize you." Tom's words dropped like stones, and Rachel finally looked away, her lips trembling. She wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Laura sobbed, covering her face with her hands, and Julia turned to the window, her shoulders tense. Mark felt the anger inside him give way to something else, a cold, clear determination. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but hard as concrete. "Get out of my house, Rachel," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. "I don't want to see you here anymore." She turned to him, her face a mixture of shock and challenge. "Mark, listen." "No," he cut her off. "I listened to you for 17 years. I listened to you say that you were tired, that you needed time, that everything would get better. And now I listen to you moan with him in our bed. Enough. Get out." Rachel gripped the sheet tighter, her fingers turning white. "This is my home too," she said, but there was no confidence in her voice. "Not anymore," Mark answered. "I'm filing for divorce. Today, take your things and leave. And take him with you." He nodded at Dan, who was still standing like a statue, not daring to intervene. Laura raised her head, her tear-stained eyes sparkling. "Yes, take him, Rachel," she said, her voice shaking with tears and anger. "He's yours now. Let's see how long you'll be in love, once you find out what he's really like." Dan turned to Laura, his face red. "Laura, "Shut up, Dan," she snapped, getting up from the floor. "You are no longer my husband. Go to your whore, and don't you dare come home." The room exploded with voices again. Julia shouted something at her mother. Laura continued to scold Dan. Tom stood silently, looking at Rachel with pain and contempt. Mark retreated to the door, feeling the last threads connecting him with this woman being torn one after another. He looked at her dark hair, which he once loved to run through with his fingers, at her eyes, in which he once saw his future and realized that she was no longer his. Maybe she never was. "You have an hour," he said, turning towards the stairs. "Then I'll call the cops." He went downstairs without looking back. In the living room, he sat on the sofa, putting the phone and recorder in front of him. They were still shouting upstairs, but he was no longer listening. He took out his laptop, opened the website of the lawyer he worked with on real estate transactions, and began searching for the number. Divorce. This word sounded like a shot, but it also gave him freedom. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Rachel Banks was no longer a part of his life. Mark sat in his Dodge Ram pickup parked on the curb in front of a house that no longer seemed his. It was already past noon, the sun hung high above Denver, casting sharp shadows on the asphalt. The Harrison and Sons truck was gone, as were Tom's Chevrolet and Julia's Honda. Rachel was gone. He saw her and Dan dragging her bags to his car, not looking at each other, like thieves caught in the act. Laura stayed longer, sitting on the porch with a blank stare, until her Ford rolled down the street. The house was empty now, but Mark couldn't bring himself to enter. Not now. He started the engine and drove off, not knowing where. Colfax Avenue hummed with traffic, the smell of fried food from the fast food joints mingling with exhaust fumes. He stopped at the Rusty Nail, an old establishment with a worn sign and windows covered in faded Broncos stickers. It was a place where he went with friends about 10 years ago, until life got him into the rut of work and marriage. Now there are almost no friends left. Those who were in common with Rachel will probably choose her side or simply disappear into silence, as usually happens after a divorce. The inside smelled of beer and time-soaked wood. Mark sat down at the counter, ordered a Coors Light, and stared at the bottle without touching it. The bartender, a gray-haired man with an anchor tattoo on his forearm, glanced at him, but said nothing. They were used to silent loners here. Mark took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Names that once meant a lot now seemed foreign. He settled on Laura Carter. Her number was still on the list from that barbecue. He thought for a moment, then wrote, "How are you? Would you like a drink?" The answer came 5 minutes later. "That sucks. Yes, go ahead. Where are you?" Half an hour later, Laura walked into the bar, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes. She sat down next to him, ordered a whiskey and cola, and looked at Mark. Her gaze was tired, but not empty. There was something alive in it, something that he recognized in himself. "Well," she said, twirling the glass in her hands, "we're now officially in the club of the deceived, right?" Mark chuckled. feeling the tension in his chest ease a little for the first time that day. Looks like it. Maybe they should give us t-shirts with the inscription, "We got scammed." Laura snorted, her laugh short but sincere. I would wear it. I would just add, "And we're still here," in small print. They drank without clinking glasses, and the silence between them was not awkward, but somehow necessary. Mark looked at her thin fingers squeezing the glass, at the wrinkles around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights in the hospital and at home. He didn't know her well, but he felt that she understood his pain in a way that no one else could. "You know," Laura said, looking into her glass, "I always thought that Dan was just tired of me. That I'm too busy, too boring. And then you called, and, damn, it was like a punch in the face. But in some ways, it's easier. Now I know it's not about me." Mark nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "I blamed myself, too. I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough." He spoke little to her, gave little. And then I saw them and realized that this was not about me. It's about her. Laura looked at him, her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. "They took everything from us, Mark. But I don't want them to take us too. Understand?" "Yes," he answered quietly. "Understand." They sat at the bar until the evening, talking about things that did not concern either Rachel or Dan. About her shifts at the hospital, where she once saved a guy from a knife wound. About his real estate deals where a client wanted a house with a mountain view, but no neighbors within a mile. They laughed at little things, shared stories that didn't require pity. This was not a date. There was no hint of flirting between them, nor the spark that is sought in novels. It was something else. Two shipwreck survivors clinging to each other to keep from drowning. The next day, Mark met her at a coffee shop on the corner of 6th Avenue. Laura came in jeans and an old sweatshirt, without makeup, but with a slight smile. They grabbed coffee to go and went for a walk in Washington Park, where the leaves were already starting to turn yellow. They talked about the past, not about the pain, but about what happened before it. Laura told how Dan once caught a huge perch on the lake and then dropped it back into the water, cursing at the top of his lungs. Mark remembered how Rachel tried to bake a cake for his birthday and burned it to charcoal, but they still ate the charred pieces, laughing until they cried. "We were happy," Laura said, looking at the ducks swimming in the pond. "At least that's what I thought." "Me too," Mark answered. "But maybe it wasn't happiness. Maybe we're just used to it." She nodded, and they walked on, not touching each other, but feeling that the distance between them was closing. Not physically, but somehow deeper. They began to meet more often, coffee in the mornings, beer in the evenings, walks without a goal. Sometimes Laura would come over to his house and help him sort through boxes of Rachel's things that he still hadn't thrown away. Sometimes he would go with her to the hospital, wait in the car while she finished her shift, and then they would drive in silence, just enjoying the silence. A week had passed since Rachel left home, taking her things and leaving behind a void that Mark didn't yet know how to fill. He was sitting in his pickup truck outside a Downing Street property office, finishing a call with a client, when he noticed a familiar figure walking across the car park. Dan Carter. Tall, with broad shoulders, but now he looked different, stooped, with bruises under his eyes, wearing a wrinkled work jacket. Mark tensed, his fingers clenching the steering wheel until the leather cracked. He hadn't seen Dan since that day in the bedroom, but every time he closed his eyes, he heard his voice, saw his hands on Rachel. Dan stopped at the pickup truck and tapped on the window. Mark rolled down the window without saying a word, his gaze as cold as ice on a lake in January. "Mark," Dan began, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "Can we talk? Like a man?" Mark was silent, looking at him. Dan shifted from foot to foot and put his hands in his pockets. "Look, I know I screwed up. I didn't want it to turn out like this. But I ask, don't finish me off, okay? Don't say anything to the bosses at Harrison. This is my work, my bread. I'll be lost without her." He fell silent, waiting for an answer. Mark looked at him, at his unshaven stubble, at the nervous tick in the corner of his mouth. Something dark and hot was boiling inside him that he had been holding back for too long. He opened the pickup door and stepped out, standing face to face with Dan. They were almost the same height, But Mark felt taller, stronger, as if anger had added weight to him. "Like a man, do you speak?" he said quietly. His voice was even, but there was a ring of steel in it. "You fucked my wife on my sheets, Dan. In my house, everything that happens next is what you deserve." Dan turned pale and his eyes widened. He raised his hands as if in defense. "Mark, I didn't mean." But Mark didn't let him finish. The first blow hit the jaw, the crunch of the bone echoed in the empty parking lot. Dan staggered but didn't fall, grabbing the door of the pickup truck. He tried to hit back, but Mark was faster. The second blow was to the nose, blood splashed onto the asphalt, dark and thick. Dan growled and rushed at Mark, but he dodged and hit again. His fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the air out of his lungs. "You thought I'd just swallow it?" Mark growled, his voice breaking into a scream. He grabbed Dan by the collar and threw him to the ground. He fell, gasping for breath, but Mark didn't stop. He hit me again and again in the face, in the chest, in the stomach. Each blow was like an exhalation, like a release from the pain that had been accumulating in him for weeks. Blood flowed down Dan's hands, along the asphalt, staining Mark's shoes, but he saw nothing but a red mist before his eyes. "Mark, that's enough," someone shouted from afar, but the voice was weak, muffled by the ringing in his ears. Dan no longer resisted. His body went limp, his head fell back, his eyes rolled back. Mark stopped, breathing heavily, his fists bloody, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He looked down. Dan was lying motionless. His face had turned into mush. His breathing was weak and intermittent. "Damn," Mark breathed, stepping back. His hands were shaking, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He heard footsteps and screams. Someone from the office ran out into the parking lot, a woman in a business suit. His colleague, I think her name was Kate. "Mark, what have you done?" she screamed, rushing towards Dan. "Call an ambulance, quickly." Mark stood looking at his hands, at the blood that was dripping from his fingers. He felt no regret, only emptiness. Kate took out her phone, dialing 911, her voice shaking. A few minutes later, sirens were heard, first an ambulance, then the police. Cars pulled into the parking lot, doors slammed, and two cops approached him, their hands on their holsters. "Sir, move away from the victim," said one of them, young, with short hair. "Hands behind your head." Mark complied, slowly raising his hands. He watched as the paramedics bent over Dan and watched as the stretcher was carried out of the ambulance. The blood was still on the asphalt, a dark puddle that spread underfoot. The cops handcuffed him, the cold metal digging into his wrists. He was led to a patrol car and pushed into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a thud. The station was noisy, phones were ringing. Someone was shouting in the next room. Mark was put in a holding cell. The steel bench was cold under his jeans. He looked at his hands. The blood was dry. The skin on his knuckles was torn off. An hour later, a detective came to him, a balding man in a wrinkled jacket with tired eyes. "Mark Banks, right?" he asked, leafing through the folder. "Your friend is in intensive care. Fractured jaw, ribs, concussion. He may not make it out. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Mark looked up, his voice hoarse but firm. "He slept with my wife. He came to ask me not to finish him off. I couldn't help myself." The detective nodded, writing something down on his notepad. "Understand, but that's no excuse, you know. You are being detained for assault with grievous bodily harm. Do you have a lawyer?" "It will be," answered Mark. He knew that he would call his old client, Jack Reynolds, who handled real estate business, and promised to help if anything happened. But now he didn't care. He did what he did and didn't regret it. The detective left, leaving him alone. Mark leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. He saw Dan's face broken, bloody, and felt only cold satisfaction. No matter what happened next, trial, prison, whatever, he knew one thing: Dan got his. And Mark finally exhaled. Mark sat in the cell for the third day, looking at the gray walls covered with scratches and stains from time to time. The smell of bleach and sweat permeated the air, and the sounds, the clanging of doors, the footsteps of guards, the muffled voices of other detainees became a background that he hardly noticed. His hands, still covered in dried blood and bruises, lay on his knees. The handcuffs were removed, but my wrists ached from the cold metal. He didn't really sleep, he just dozed, falling into short, anxious dreams, where he saw Dan's face, broken and motionless, and heard Rachel's voice whispering, "I'm in love." The cell door clanged, and a guard entered, a stocky guy with short hair and a tired look. "Banks, you have a visitor," he said, nodding toward the corridor. 5 minutes. Mark stood up, feeling his legs go numb, and followed him. Laura Carter was waiting for him in the visiting room. She sat behind the glass, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. She was wearing a nurse's uniform jacket, slightly wrinkled, as if she had just finished her shift. Seeing him, she smiled faintly, but there was something serious and decisive in her eyes. "Mark," she said when he sat down opposite her and picked up the phone, "you look like crap." He grinned, feeling something like warmth for the first time in days. "Thank you, Laura. You're not in the best shape either." She nodded, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I was in the hospital. Dan's. He will pull through, but not without consequences." Mark tensed, his gaze became sharp. "What's wrong with him?" Laura took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. "Fractured jaw, ribs, concussion, you already know that. But also, a groin injury. Doctors say he will most likely no longer be able to have children. The blow was too strong." Mark froze, digesting her words. He didn't aim there specifically at that moment, he didn't think at all. He just hit, splashing out everything that had accumulated. But now, hearing this, he felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Dan paid a price greater than he expected, and yet it won't bring Rachel back to him. It won't erase that scene in the bedroom. "I don't feel sorry for him," he finally said, looking into Laura's eyes. "After everything he did." "Me too," she answered quietly. "But I don't want you to sit down because of him, Mark. He's not worth it." Mark shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I beat him to a pulp, Laura. The cops won't just let this go. The detective said I was facing felony assault, maybe even prison." Laura leaned closer to the glass, her voice became firmer. "I talked to the doctors, and with one of the cops, he is my patient. He comes for injections for diabetes. There is a chance for everything to turn out differently. Dan doesn't have to press charges if we persuade him." "Shall we persuade?" Mark frowned. "After what I did to him, he would rather die than let me go." "He won't die," Laura said, her eyes sparkling. "I know Dan. He's a coward when it comes down to it. And he is afraid of losing his job, his reputation, everything he has left. I can put pressure on him to say that if he sues, I will tell everyone, colleagues, friends, even his mother, about Rachel, about how he destroyed 2 families, and you will add your entries. He won't want this." Mark thought as he looked at her. Laura was right, Dan was a weakling under all that bravado. He came to him to ask him like a man, begging him not to tell his superiors. Maybe he really will break. "What if he doesn't agree?" Mark asked. "Then I'll find a lawyer," she replied. "I have connections in the hospital. There are people who owe me money. We will prove that you were in a state of passion. Rachel, Dan, all this dirt is a mitigating factor, but I believe that it will not come to trial." Mark nodded, feeling his chest warm. Laura didn't just talk, she acted as an ally, as a person who understands his pain and is ready to fight for him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "After everything he did to you, you could have just left." Laura looked at him, her gaze soft but firm. "Because you don't deserve to have your life ruined because of him." "Me too. We both survived, Mark. Let's not let them take more than they already took." He nodded, gripping the phone tighter. "Fine. Do what you can. I'm with you." 2 days later, Laura returned. Mark was already in the interrogation room when she entered with a detective, the same balding man in a wrinkled jacket. There was a folder on the table, and next to it were his phone and voice recorder, which were confiscated during the arrest. "Mr. Banks," the detective began, sitting down opposite him, "we have news. Mr. Carter declined to press charges. He said it was a personal spat and he didn't want it to escalate. We are closing the case due to the lack of a victim statement. Mark looked at Laura, who was standing against the wall with her arms crossed. She nodded slightly, her lips twitching into a faint smile. "This is all?" Mark asked, not believing his ears. "That's it," the detective confirmed. "You are free, but I advise you to control yourself in the future. Do this again, and you will be out of luck." Mark nodded, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. The detective left, leaving them alone. Laura came closer, her eyes shining with fatigue, but there was relief in them. "How did you do it?" he asked, standing up. "I went to his room," she said, shrugging her shoulders. "He was lying there, covered in bandages, with a tube in his nose. I said that if he turns on you, I will destroy his life. She told me about the recordings, that he would be fired, that everyone would find out. And then she added that you are ready to go to the end if he doesn't back down. It broke in 5 minutes." Mark looked at her, not knowing what to say. She was small, fragile in appearance, but inside there was a steel rod. "Thank you, Laura," he said finally. "I wouldn't have made it out without you." "We're in this together," she replied, smiling wider. "Let's get out of here. You need beer, and I need whiskey." They left the site. The sun was in their eyes, but the air seemed cleaner than inside. Mark knew that Dan would survive, but his life would never be the same. No job, no children, no future that he might have dreamed of. And yet Mark did not feel guilty, only freedom, and Laura walked next to him, not just an ally, but a person who helped him breathe again. It's been 2 months since Mark left the station, thanks to Laura and her steely determination. Life began to level out, albeit slowly, like a river seeking a new channel after a flood. He returned to work in real estate, showing houses, signing contracts, but now everything was different, quieter, calmer. He spent his evenings either alone or with Laura. They met a couple times a week. Coffee at St. Mark's on 17th Avenue, beer at the Rusty Nail, walks in the park where the leaves had already fallen, leaving the trees as bare and vulnerable as their own lives. Laura was nearby, but between them there was nothing but friendship pure, without hints or expectations. They talked about work, about the weather, about how she once spilled coffee on a doctor at the hospital, and how he sold a house to a couple who wanted something with the soul of Colorado, but without the bears. Sometimes they were silent, and this silence was comfortable, like an old blanket. Mark appreciated her for this, for the fact that she did not get into his wounds, but was there when they began to bleed. One morning in early December, Mark was sitting in his pickup truck, checking mail before showing a home in Cherry Creek. His phone buzzed with a message from Julie, Rachel's daughter. They had not spoken since that day in the bedroom, but he knew that she was as angry with her mother as he was. The text was short. "Did you hear? She's marrying him. This weekend." Mark reread the message 3 times, feeling his stomach tighten. Rachel and Dan. Wedding. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and stared out the windshield, where the first snowflakes were settling on the glass. It was expected, and yet it felt like a punch in the gut. He knew Rachel had left for Dan, but marriage. So fast, it was like her, trying to justify everything she'd done, putting a pretty veneer on the pile of crap she'd left behind. He called Laura without thinking. She answered after the second ring, her voice sleepy. She had just finished a night shift. "Mark, what's happened?" "Rachel is marrying Dan," he said, his voice even, but inside he was seething. "This weekend." Laura fell silent, then exhaled. "God, does she think this will fix everything? As if the ring would wash away her sins?" "It seems so," he replied, turning the ignition key in his hands. "Just wanted you to know." "Thank you," she said. "How are you?" "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "Wicked, but I'm not surprised." "Do you want to meet?" she asked. "I'm free in an hour." "Yes," he said. "Rusty Nail. Come." They sat at the bar, Laura with whiskey, Mark with beer. The bar was almost empty, except for a couple of old men playing darts in the corner and the bartender wiping glasses. Laura looked at him, her eyes tired but attentive. "She's always been like this," she said, twirling the glass in her hands. Rachel. She needs everything to look right, even if it's rotten inside. Dan probably thinks he's won a prize. Mark snorted, taking a sip of his beer. If this is a prize, then with marriage. He's in no condition to celebrate. Laura nodded. She knew more. She worked in a hospital and heard gossip from colleagues. Dan was discharged a couple of weeks ago, but his life has gone downhill. The injuries from the beating left a mark not only on the body, but also on the psyche. She told Mark what she had learned from the intensive care nurse who was caring for him. He's impotent, Laura said quietly, looking into the glass. After what you did, doctors say it's due to damage. And not only physically, he is afraid. Paranoia, panic attacks. Don't leave the house unless forced. Rachel probably thinks the wedding will cure him. Mark listened, feeling cold satisfaction. He didn't want this. He didn't plan to take away Dan's male strength. But now, knowing, he didn't regret it. Dan ruined his life, and here is his payback. A body that no longer obeys, a mind that is bursting at the seams. What about intimacy? He asked, looking at Laura. She shook her head. I doubt. My sister said he was avoiding her. Even at home, he goes to bed in another room and says that he is not ready. Rachel is probably furious, but she keeps her face up. She needs to show everyone that she made the right choice. Mark pictured it. Rachel in a white dress, with a tight smile, and Dan hiding behind her, pale, trembling, unable to even touch his new wife. It was almost funny if it weren't so sad. She wanted freedom, he said, looking at the bottle. And I got a cage worse than mine. Laura nodded, her fingers gripping the glass. Dan, too. He thought he would get it, but now he is afraid of his own shadow. They both lost Mark. And we're still here. He looked at her, feeling her words sink into his chest. They weren't a couple, they weren't holding hands, they weren't seeking comfort in hugs. But they were together, two people who were betrayed, but who did not break. Laura became his anchor, and he became hers, and that was enough. On Saturday, Mark learned from Julia that the wedding had gone through. No grand celebration, a quiet ceremony at City Hall. A few colleagues from Harrison strained smiles. Rachel sent Julia a photo of her in a simple white dress, Dan in a rumpled suit, his face pale, his eyes downcast. Julia wrote, "Looks like a funeral, not a wedding." Mark showed the photo to Laura when they met in the park on Sunday. She looked and snorted. They're both pretending, she said, throwing a pebble into the pond. But it's their choice. Let them live with him. Mark nodded, looking out over the water. He did not feel joy from their misfortune, but there was no pity either. Rachel and Dan chose their path, and now it has caught up with them: impotence, fear, paranoia, loneliness in a marriage that was supposed to be their salvation. And Mark moved on, with Laura by his side, not as a lover, but as a friend who helped him keep his head above water. "Let's go," he said, getting up. "I want coffee." She smiled and followed him up. "Only if you pay." "Agreed," he replied, and they walked, leaving the past behind, step by step. Another month has passed, and winter in Denver has finally come into its own. Snow lay thick on the streets, the roofs of houses in Washington Park glistened with frost, and the mountains on the horizon seemed closer in the frosty air. Mark and Laura continued to meet: coffee in the morning, beer in the evening, long walks where words were not as important as each other's presence. Their friendship became more than just support for two survivors. Mark began to notice how his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, how her laugh, short, slightly raspy, made him smile, even if the day was shitty. He found himself thinking about her when she wasn't around, how she copes with night shifts, how she looks in her old sweatshirt, sitting by the fire. It was not like Rachel, not a storm of passion, not blind attraction. It was quiet, deep, like a river that flows under the ice. Mark was in no hurry to call it love, but he felt something changing in him. Laura became not just a friend, but a person without whom his days seemed empty. He didn't tell her about this. He was afraid to scare her away. He was afraid that she was not ready, that her wounds from Dan were still too fresh. But every time she looked at him with her tired but warm eyes, He realized that he could not keep it inside forever. One evening in mid-January, they were sitting at his house. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting reflections on the walls, and the wind howled outside the window, driving snowflakes across the yard. Laura was sitting on the sofa, legs crossed, with a mug of tea in her hands. Her hair was down, blonde strands falling around her face, and she looked relaxed, almost vulnerable. Mark sat opposite in an old chair with a bottle of beer, which he twirled in his hands, collecting his thoughts. "Laura," he began, his voice slightly hoarse with excitement, "I was thinking, maybe you should move in with me." She froze, her fingers gripping the mug tighter. Her gaze darted to him. There was surprise mixed with something else, uncertainty, maybe fear. "Move?" she asked, putting the mug on the table. "Are you serious?" Mark nodded, feeling his heart beat faster. "Yes, I know this is unexpected, but we get along well. I like it when you're here, and I thought that you wouldn't have to commute home after your shifts, that we could. Well, be closer." Laura looked away, looking at the fire. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mark waited, afraid that he had crossed the line, that she would get up and leave. But she was silent, and this silence was louder than words. "I don't know, Mark," she finally said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. This, this is a big step. After everything with Dan, I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like this, even if it's just to live together." "I'm not rushing you," he said quickly, leaning forward. "This is not about us immediately becoming a couple or something more. I feel good with you, and I want you to feel good. Your apartment is small, you are always complaining about your upstairs neighbors, and I have plenty of space here. We could try." Laura looked at him, her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She ran her hand through her hair and sighed. "Do you really want this?" she asked. "Or is it just because you're lonely?" Mark thought, looking into her eyes. He could lie, say it was just friendship, convenience. But he was tired of lying to himself, to her, to the world. "I want this because you are important to me, Laura," he said, his voice firm but soft. "Not just as a friend. I, I'm starting to feel more for you, and I don't want to lose you." She fell silent again, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweatshirt. Mark saw her struggling with herself, with doubts, with the past, with the fact that Dan left scars in her that had not yet healed. But then she nodded, slowly, almost hesitantly. "Okay," she said, "I will try. But Mark, let's not rush. No expectations, no promises. Just live together and see what happens. Okay?" "Okay," he replied, feeling a smile spread across his face. "No haste. Just you and me." She smiled back, a weak but sincere smile that brightened her face. "Then I'll bring my things over the weekend. But a warning, I have a ton of boxes of medical journals, and I have no intention of throwing them away." "We'll find a place," he said, laughing. "My basement is empty." A week later, Laura moved. It wasn't a big deal, no flowers, no romantic gestures. Just Mark's pickup truck, loaded with her boxes, an old sofa, which they hardly dragged into the house, and her cat, Red Murphy, who immediately occupied the windowsill. They spent the day sorting through things, arguing about where to put her coffee pot and whether to hang her heart anatomy poster in the living room. It was everyday, but in this everydayness there was something warm, real. That night they sat in the kitchen, Laura in her sweatshirt, Mark in his Rockies t-shirt. She ate pizza, he drank beer, and there was silence between them, not awkward, but comfortable. Mark looked at her profile in the light of the lamp, and felt something growing inside him. Not passion, not obsession, but quiet, deep affection. He fell in love with her, her strength, her humor, the way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed. But he didn't talk about it. Not yet. "Don't you regret it?" she asked suddenly, looking at him over the piece of pepperoni. "Not a bit," he answered, smiling. "And you?" "Not yet," she said, and a spark flashed in her eyes. "But if you start snoring, I'll throw you into the basement." We agreed, he laughed, and they continued to eat, like two people who found in each other not only salvation, but also a home. Mark leaned back in the old chair, listening to Laura making noise in the kitchen, putting food into the cabinets. The house smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, the morning breakfast that Mark was so happy about after a night full of anxious thoughts. Outside the window, the snowstorm had died down, and the rays of the winter sun were carefully breaking through the fragile icicles on the eaves. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to think for a moment about how much his life had changed in recent months. Once upon a time, he woke up next to Rachel. It seemed like an eternity ago. Now his morning began with the sound of Laura's steps and the grumbling of the red cat Murphy, who demanded his portion of food. The habit of chatting about trifles over a cup of coffee gradually grew into a quiet feeling of comfort. They still did not call themselves a couple, not loudly, but both knew that the warm feeling between them was growing day by day. Laura looked out from behind the joint, holding toast in her hands. "Do you know what I understood? I never bought any eggs. You'll have to make do with coffee and bread." Mark chuckled. "It's coming. And if I want an omelet, at the very least, we'll order delivery." "As a last resort, you'll have to ask the neighbors," Laura corrected him and winked. "If you remember that yesterday you had empty shelves in the refrigerator." She smiled at him, a soft, understanding smile. Mark was about to get up from his chair and help her when the doorbell rang. Mute and insistent, it echoed strangely in the heart of the house. Mark looked at Laura, raising his eyebrows questioningly. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. "No," Laura answered, shrugging. "Maybe a courier?" But as soon as Mark approached the door, he realized that the courier was hardly worth waiting for so early in the morning. Behind the glass could be seen a thin female figure in a dark down jacket with a hood sprinkled with snow. He opened the door and immediately recognized Julia, Rachel's daughter from her first marriage. The girl was clearly excited. Her cheeks were flushed not only from the cold, but also from the emotions that gripped her. "Mark, hello," she blurted out, taking off her hood and shaking her dark hair. "Can I come in?" Mark nodded, letting her into the house. Laura looked out of the kitchen and smiled at Julia, nodding in greeting. The girl tried to answer with a smile, but it came out strained. It was clear that something was greatly bothering her. "Come into the living room," Mark suggested. "Now Laura will make you some hot tea." Julia just nodded and followed him. When everyone had settled down, Laura sat down on the sofa, Mark sank into his favorite chair, and Julia remained standing in the middle of the room, breathing spasmodically. There was a short silence. And only then did Mark notice that the girl's eyes were red. She had apparently been crying recently, or had been crying all the way here. "Sit down," he suggested softly. "Tell me what happened." Julia stared at the floor, pursing her lips as if trying to gather her strength. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up at Mark. "I didn't know who else to go to." "Mom." She swallowed. "Dan left her. He packed his things and filed for divorce." The words hung in the air like a deafening blow. Mark felt everything shrink inside him. A strange mixture of relief, gloating, and maybe even resentment flared up in his chest. Laura gently touched his arm, as if trying to keep him balanced. Julia sat down tiredly on the sofa and, pressing her elbows to her sides, straightened her back. "I don't want to deal with this," she added, looking at Laura. "But my mother called me yesterday all in tears, begging me to come. She said that Dan turned out to be a traitor and ran away to another woman. Only, apparently, she forgot that she herself had once done the same thing. She left the family, abandoned you, Mark, and destroyed our home. And now she has new problems." She sighed, biting her lip as if apologizing for the harshness of her words. "I understand that it's unpleasant for you to hear about this. But I can't help her. Everything in my life is already difficult." And she yells into the phone that this bastard kept lying to her and has now found someone else. Allegedly, she noticed correspondence on his phone. Mark exchanged a glance with Laura. The irony of the situation was too obvious, too bitter. Dan and Rachel had once destroyed two families together, and now their own marriage had lasted only a few months. So she found out he was having an affair, Laura clarified, moving closer to Julia as if offering her support. "Yes," the girl nodded. "Mom says that he is dating some woman from a neighboring state. He went to her under the pretext of business trips, but in fact he spent weekends with her. And all this time, while my mother was trying to restore her image of a good wife, he was already playing a double game. Something tightened inside Mark. He remembered his own suspicions and the day he learned of Rachel's betrayal. Feeling that way in your own skin is one thing, but now knowing that Rachel is going through exactly the same thing is strange. He felt neither compassion nor malice towards her, more like a kind of cold indifference. "And what do you want from us, Julie?" he asked finally, trying to speak softly. "You didn't just come." Julia nodded, twirling the edge of the scarf in her hands. "Yes, I wanted. Just to ask. Maybe you could talk to her. She doesn't listen to anyone. Father, that is, Tom, also does not want to communicate with her after everything that happened. I understand that she betrayed you, but—" Here the girl's voice trembled. "She is my mother. I can't leave her, but I don't want to help her. I can't. I have work, study, everything has piled up. She calls every day, cries, asks to come. I said that I hardly could, and in response she began to accuse me of choosing sides." Laura sighed softly, lowering her eyes. The situation was difficult. Rachel herself left the family, destroyed what she had, and now, when faced with the same betrayal, she expected everyone to rush to console her. But Julia really has a hard time. She is essentially left alone between two fires. "I don't know what to say," Mark admitted. "I'll be honest, Julie, I don't care how your mother lives now. I don't think Laura really wants to talk to her either. But I understand that you are between a rock and a hard place." The girl stared at the floor and then covered her eyes with her hand as if fighting back tears. "I'm just tired, Mark. I'm tired of her complaints and whining. She acted like she did everything right, and now that her world has fallen apart, you see, she needs support. And for some reason, it's mine." Laura gently placed her hand on Julia's shoulder. "You know," she said quietly, "if you're having such a hard time, you can just tell her that you need a break. You don't have to solve her problems. She is a grown woman and made her own decisions, and now he is reaping their benefits." "But she's my mother," Julia whispered, pursing her lips. "No matter how angry I am with her, I still don't want anything to happen to her." Mark looked at Laura. It was difficult to give advice in such a situation where the mother herself is destroying her life, and her daughter cannot remain indifferent. He stood up, walked over to the girl, and sat down next to her. "You know what?" he said quietly. "I'll talk to her. Just once, and with no guarantee that it will change anything. But I'll do it for you, so that you don't feel guilty. I will say that she should leave you alone, that you have your own life. And if she has problems with Dan or anyone else, let her solve them herself." Julia looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mark," she said, and her voice trembled a little. "I will never forget what you did for me and for Dad." She stopped short, remembering that she still called him Dad, even though she was not her own. "You were always there, even when Mom acted like a selfish person." "Well," Mark smiled sadly, "I guess I just can't do otherwise." Laura, watching them, exhaled with noticeable relief. Judging by the expression on her face, she considered this decision the best possible. Let Mark talk to Rachel directly at least once. Let him put an end to it, or at least set boundaries so that Julia doesn't suffer. They talked a little more about Julia's work, about how she delivers design projects, about plans for the future. Laura treated her to warm tea and cookies, and for the first time in a long time, calm, almost cheerful notes sounded in the girl's voice. It was clear that she felt a little better when she threw out all her emotions and received support. When Julia got ready to leave, Mark walked her to the door. The snow had already stopped, and the morning became sunny and clear. Julia thanked him and Laura again, hugging both of them goodbye. Outside, she stopped on the porch and looked back. "If anything, call her today." Until she started pestering me with new messages. Mark nodded, putting his hands in his pockets. "Okay, good luck, Julie." She smiled, brushed away an unbidden tear, and walked to her car, parked at the side of the road. Mark watched her go until she started the engine and drove out onto the snowy road, disappearing around the bend. Returning to the house, he saw that Laura had already cleared everything from the table and was now standing at the window, looking out onto the street. Feeling his presence, she turned around. "Are you sure you're ready to talk to Rachel?" she asked quietly. "I know how hard this is for you." "No," he admitted, "but there is no other way out. Julia is too exhausted. I don't want her to suffer because of her mother's whims." Laura nodded. She understood that both of them had not yet completely recovered from everything that had happened. But this was a step towards, if not reconciliation, but some kind of final clarification. Let Rachel realize that she cannot so easily barge into her daughter's life and demand the impossible from her. "Call me when you're ready," Laura suggested, softening her voice. "And remember, I'm here if you need help." Mark sighed, ran his hand through his hair, and felt the tension in his chest release a little. Perhaps this was the meaning of the new life, in the people who are nearby, who support. Even if everything around you was falling apart, they remained your safe haven. "Thank you," he said, taking a step towards Laura and taking her hand. "I appreciate it." Mark couldn't decide to call for a long time. He walked from room to room, postponing the moment of an unpleasant conversation. Laura watched him silently, realizing that he was fighting his own internal battle. She didn't press, didn't rush, she just stayed nearby in case he needed support. Finally, he sat down in a chair, sighed, and dialed a familiar number. The beeps sounded like gunshots in the silence of the room, each one like a jolt in the heartbeat. Once upon a time, he and Rachel had a common home, common plans, a common life. Now it's all down to strained phone calls. "Hello?" Rachel's voice was sharp, tense, like that of someone who is expecting bad news and is ready to defend herself. Mark swallowed before speaking. "Hi, this is Mark." There was a short pause. Apparently Rachel was not expecting the call, or wondered why he was addressing her. "And what do you need?" she asked finally, sharply and coldly. Mark clutched the phone tighter, his gaze automatically darting to Laura, who was sitting on the sofa. She nodded to him, silently letting him know that everything was okay. "I need you to stop dragging everyone around you into your problems," he spoke in an even tone. "I just saw Julia. She doesn't know what to do with your endless complaints, your threats and hysterics. She has her own life, study, and work. She doesn't have to solve your problems." Heavy breathing was heard on the other end, and then Rachel's voice grew stronger and sounded attacking. "So you decided to play the noble father, huh? Don't make me laugh, Mark. You yourself abandoned me and ran to Laura. Traitor." Mark felt anger welling up inside him. He hated it when everything was turned upside down. "Traitor?" he asked, trying to control himself. "It seemed to me that you brought another man into our common house and made love to him on our bed. Or am I confusing something?" At the other end there was silence, in which static hissed. Then Rachel blurted out, almost screaming, "You don't understand why I did this. You never understood me. I'm tired of being an addition to your home. I'm tired of waiting for you to show attention. I'm tired of putting up with your eternal excuses that you have work. And now you dare to blame me." Mark could hardly restrain a sarcastic grin. The guilt here is undeniable. "You indulged in an affair and ruined our marriage. It was your choice. Nobody forced you. And now there is no need to shift responsibility. And Laura," Rachel snapped, not wanting to give in, "do you think I don't know anything? You probably got together before I left. Most likely, you were already messing with her then." Mark rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the irritation pounding in his temples. He tried to speak calmly, but his voice no, and even broke. "Laura appeared in my life much later, and certainly not when you and Dan were frolicking on our sheets. Remind you who started this dirty game first." Rachel took a sharp breath, but her voice still rang, as if she had painted herself into a corner and was trying to defend herself in every way. "Dan was a mistake, I admit. But at least he noticed me and complimented me, and you just become colder every year." "An excellent excuse," Mark said coldly, "but this doesn't change anything. You did what you did. Dan took revenge on you by leaving for someone else. Now you are reaping the fruits that you planted. He was silent for a moment, thinking about how to formulate what he had decided to have this conversation for. How can I explain it so that she can hear? Listen, he continued more calmly. I didn't call to rub salt in the wounds or stir up a scandal. I called to say, leave our daughter alone. Stop burdening her with your problems and demands. She's an adult, yes, but that doesn't mean she should be your therapist. If you feel bad, turn to a professional or figure it out yourself. You can't take your anger out on Julia anymore. It's not her fault that things didn't work out for you again. Rachel didn't answer, and for a while the only sound on the phone was her rapid breathing. Then there was a quiet sob. Mark couldn't tell if she was crying or just trying to hold back her emotions. So you don't care, she said in a trembling voice. Forgot me so easily. We were together for 17 years, Mark. Was it really that bad? Mark looked at Laura, who caught his gaze and frowned slightly, realizing that the conversation had gone somewhere wrong. But he didn't look away, trying to be completely honest. I didn't forget. I worried for a long time. I was in a lot of pain. But now I have a new life. With Laura, and yes, he paused a little, I won't say that I don't remember our good days, but that's in the past. I do not want and will not return to you if you hint at it. Rachel snorted bitterly. You wish you could. Are you living happily now? You know, I watched your photos on social networks. I see you smiling. And here I have to deal with divorce papers, debts, yet another betrayal. Mark closed his eyes. He was ready for this tirade, but still it touched him to the quick. Once upon a time, Rachel was the woman he loved, whom he took as his wife. But now she seemed like a stranger, angry, offended by the whole world. And in her voice there was not a drop of remorse for the past, only a thirst to shift the blame. I don't wish you harm, he said evenly, but you yourself reached this point, and now I have no responsibility to save you. I'm already trying to do what I can, protect our daughter from another injury. Don't ask for anything else. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Rachel exhaled heavily. Okay, you pretend that you don't care. So be it. Yes, I made a mistake. But a strange humility mixed with residual anger was heard in her voice. Was it really impossible to try to understand me? Mark clenched his jaw. It was a vicious circle, and he didn't want to go back there. They both once missed the opportunity to understand each other. It's too late now. I hope you figure out your life, he said quietly, exhaling. And I won't repeat myself. Don't touch Julia unless she herself needs your support. She needs stability, not your tantrums. A few more heartbeats and a short hang-up signal sounded on the phone. He realized that Rachel had simply hung up the call. The room became silent, except for the slight crackling sound from the fireplace. Mark looked at the phone as if not fully believing that the conversation ended so quickly and so meaninglessly. Laura got up from the sofa and walked over to him. She carefully placed her hand on his shoulder. How are you? He looked down, running his hand through his hair, empty, and it was as if a heavy stone had been taken out of my chest. I'm not glad she's suffering, but I can't feel sympathy either. Everything that happened is in the past. Laura nodded, putting her arm around his shoulders. He laid his head on her shoulder, feeling the tension slowly release. At least now he said everything he wanted. He put an end to it, even if Rachel didn't accept it. Do you think she will leave Julia behind? Laura asked quietly, stroking his back. I hope so, Mark replied. At the very least, she will have to understand that we will no longer succumb to her manipulations. He closed his eyes, listening to Laura's even breathing. Everything suddenly acquired clear boundaries. There is him, his new life, the people he values and who value him. And Rachel was a blind corner that he was no longer going to look into. She chose her path and is still not ready to admit her share of guilt. He could only hope that Julia would have the strength and wisdom to prevent her mother from destroying her peace. Laura understood how difficult this call was for him. She knew the price of every word spoken about the past. Her own scars from Dan's betrayal stung too. But when they were together, it became easier. This was probably the most important thing after all the losses. After a couple of minutes, they continued to stand in each other's arms, and the phone lay on the table, screen down, as if offended that the conversation ended so abruptly. But Mark had no intention of calling back. He had nothing else to talk about with Rachel. He did what he promised Julia. The rest is not his concern. Well, Laura broke the silence, raising her head and moving away slightly. We should still have breakfast. Or will it already be lunch? Mark smiled, although his eyes were still sad. Let's call it head of trouble. I'm even ready to make scrambled eggs myself if we find eggs from our neighbors. Laura laughed, a short, bright laugh that reminded him that the world was still open to joy, and that they have something in common ahead that Rachel hasn't had in years, a mutual desire to listen and understand each other. Good idea, she finally said, and pulled him by the hand towards the kitchen. A few weeks later, a short but revealing meeting took place. Mark and an old client were inspecting a house within the city, and when he went outside, he saw a lonely female figure in a cheap coat on the corner. It was Rachel. She recognized him first, freezing in place. Her face was drawn, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She seemed to be hesitating whether to approach. But Mark had already made a decision for both of them. He nodded briefly to her and pretended to be in a hurry to the car, not wanting to sort things out under the gaze of strangers. Mark! Still, she called out to him quietly. He turned around. There was a plea in her gaze, but she didn't add any words, as if she didn't know what to say. He answered her with a silent look, in which there was neither hostility nor sympathy, only detachment. After that, Rachel turned away, and he walked to the car, realizing that it was unlikely that they would ever cross this line and start talking for real. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.